One of the strangest experiences I've had in my life, people have described as a numinous experience, but it's one that was so ordinary at the time that I didn't think to talk about it, even to the people in the morning. I didn't notice anything. And even as the years have gone by, it's been very slow for me to realize that it should be written down and talked about, because it's really quite significant. Interestingly enough, before I get there, is what brought it, is my work with veterans over the last 10 years. And bringing an archetypal model, which I've drawn largely from an organization called Soldier's Heart, into the work that we do with veterans at Duquesne University. One of the central themes that we know from traditional warrior cultures is that a veteran can never be truly healed until he's made or she has made peace with the dead. And I've worked with that theme quite a bit. So back to 1986, when I was in the Umfolozi Basin with the very famous brother of the golfer Gary Player. His brother was Ian Player, who was worked in nature conservation in KwaZulu-Natal, and specifically the Umfolozi Basin. In 1986, I went with him and his guide, Makubu Ntombela, who had been working in the Umfolozi since 1914 and was a Zulu diviner. We had a small group of about 6 of us and the 2 guides, Ian Player and Makubu, and Ntombela. And the first night we were there in the park, everybody went to sleep. We were lying on the ground and taking turns because we were in African wilderness, surrounded by wildlife, including lion and elephant and so on. We slept on the ground but took turn standing guard through the night and keeping a little fire going and that sort of thing. And I woke around midnight. I could see my companion sitting on a log, listening to the sounds of the night. Could hear the whoop of hyenas occasionally, or a bark of a jackal, and so on. I think most nights we could hear lion and things like that. It was a gorgeous African night. I was a little disappointed, though, to realize that we were actually not in the depth of the Umfolozi Basin as I had thought, but that we were actually right next to the edge of the park, because only about 1 kilometer away on the ridge that I could see silhouetted against the starlight, there was clearly a village and a festival going on. There were drums and laughing and singing, and occasionally I could hear cowbells and so on. I had a look, but I couldn't see anything. But it was unmistakably there, that this village on the edge of the park. And I sat and propped up on my elbow and looked around for a while. Probably after about 10 or 15 minutes, I actually pulled my sleeping bag over my ears to, I think the sound had woken me up. Pulled the sleeping bag over my ears so I could block out the sound and drift off to sleep. Well, in the morning, people were having breakfast and chatting about the events of the night, and it was so ordinary that it never occurred to me to say anything about it. But at some point after breakfast, we'd already been up an hour or so, and I just happened to mention that I hadn't realized we were at the edge of the park. Ian Player translated for Makubu, who couldn't speak English, and so we went back and forth in translation, and he looked quite interested in what had happened, and I started to realize they seemed to be interested in my experience, and I sort of said, oh no, it was up there on the ridge, I could hear it, and I had a look but couldn't see anything, and so on, and then the punchline: there'd been nobody living on that ridge for over 100 years, but there had been a village there. In fact, it was the village where Makubu was born, and where, no, he wasn't born there. His father lived there, and his father had made the spears that had slaughtered, amongst the spears that had slaughtered 1,000 British soldiers not far away at a place called Isandlwana, which viewers might remember was the place that was attacked just before the survivors retreated a couple of miles away to a place called Rorke's Drift, which became a famous movie. And they were able to survive at Rorke's Drift. I do remember that when I was lying there listening to the sounds, I wondered whether there was, what the festival was. Was it a successful birth, or perhaps the visit of an honoured guest or something? And I certainly did come to realize that I had been honoured by being somehow welcomed into this ancient Zulu warrior presence, because those British soldiers would have been wearing Brooke family wool. My family has had a father-to-son wool business for about 500 years, and produced all the wool through the whole rise of the British Empire. And so there I was as a white son and grandson of colonialists, and the British Empire and its military history, being welcomed and given hospitality to this Zulu village, which was the village of the father of Mr. Mtogbela. There seemed to be, and I was slow to realize over years of what a gift this was. The numinosity of that experience is stronger with me now than it was 30 years ago, when it was marked by its ordinariness. By the way, to those who say, well, maybe he was sleeping or hallucinating, I can play that Cartesian game too, but quite frankly, I know the difference between being awake and being asleep as well as you do. It's very interesting how tempting it is to ask for some sort of explanation. I do have a few thoughts which I think are relevant. First of all, some people would say it was a synchronous experience in the Jungian tradition, because there's a meeting between psychological meaning and some sort of material or spatial event out there in the world. I think it's important then to recognize that the term synchronicity marks out a realm of experience. It doesn't actually explain anything at all. I also think that the term synchronicity is somewhat problematic, because it starts with a separation of meaning and place in the first place, and then is sort of used in a magical way to try and bridge a gap that perhaps shouldn't have been there in the first place. In that sense, that reminds me how much closer to Heideggerian phenomenology I am, that the presencing or awakening of being should not be separated from meaning. The other thought I have is that in psychology generally, if you open an intro psych book and you study perception, there will be an image of the eye, a diagram of the eye with light waves impinging on the eye, and there'll be an ear with pressure waves impinging on the eardrum, and then the idea is that these sort of pulses will travel into the brain, which will somehow work them into some sort of meaningful experience. This runs all the way through psychology, and it actually is foundational in most of psychoanalysis too, in its language of mental representations and self-representations and other representations. I don't see you, I have a mental representation of you. And all this representationalist thinking belies this Galilean Cartesian world, which ultimately is mathematics. And I think that my experience emphasizes something that should be obvious to us, because it is true in our experience, which is that place is not space, and place is not a matter of projection. I remember saying on a listserv the other day, we whisper in church and we shout on the beach. And those are not matters of projection. Place has its own psychological life. Places gather psyche, and of course psyche is deeply historical. And so I think that the psychology, it's helpful to start to think of psychological life. If we think of psychological life as embedded and world disclosive, that mind is not psyche, then it helps us understand that psyche is also mediated and given to us through place, and that that's not a matter of projection. One of the other things that's interesting about thinking of the phenomenology or the psychology of place is that we've come to think of space and time as sort of different coordinates. Space is measured in with rulers and time with clocks. But I think that my experience, or any experience of place, the experience of this place called Cape Town, or of a church, or of the seaside beach, the experience of place is not of a place that is emptied of time. Places gather history. All being is being in time. There's no such thing as a presencing or a gathering of a world that is not within that great open expanse of temporality in which we're all gathered. The word Jung has become, like the word Freud, so loaded. It's quite interesting to do a sort of a Jungian word association study with the word Jung, or with the word archetype. Or if you say that you're interested in Jung, it's a bit like saying you're interested in Freud. You have absolutely no control over what the person hears. So I'm often hesitant to do so, but I like to say that that I'm deeply Jungian in some ways. But my love of Jung is critical. I like to believe that many of us in the field read Jung with the same sort of critical eye that most people now would read Freud, that he's part of the history of ideas. And we're always in dialogue, though, with him because of the extraordinary richness and complexity and contradictoriness of his thought. These are not just paradoxes, these are real contradictions. Jung writes from different perspectives, with different audiences. He's kind of his own eclectic. And eclecticism has all sorts of conceptual problems, and despite his great scholarship, I don't think he was a very good thinker. Unlike Freud, for example, whose thinking is so elegant and clear. When somebody criticizes Jung, his response is usually just to shout louder. A lot of his writings now, I just can't imagine would ever get published today. So I don't think he was a very good thinker. But it does mean that he's lovely to go back and read because of all the contradictions and twists and turns that his writing makes. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about Jung's transference fantasy to Africa, the sort of image of Africa that he had, and he went to see Africa, and of course he found what he thought he would find, and then scurried back to Europe. And there are awful problems of whiteness and colonialism in his relationship to blackness and Africans and people who are non-white, so in quotes, all over the world. And we're very critical of that, rightly. But the way out of that is also within Jung himself. I mean, that's only one reading of Jung, and Jung can be read very differently, especially through his alchemical work and just his personal sensibilities. Living a life which refused, I think I'm right in remembering that he refused electricity in his little tower in Bollingen and just built a fire when it was cold in winter, and had such a wonderfully, if you like, primitive sort of sense of his being in the world and part of this multiple intelligence of life in which he was embedded and played his part. So the way out of Jung's awkwardness and him at his worst is also Jung at his best, you know. And it's one of the reasons that I love going back to Jung. One of the things that does concern me a lot about the field, though, is that there is a kind of Jung fundamentalism that lingers, I think, maybe in America rather more strongly than elsewhere that I know. And that's just not helpful. It worries me that Jungian organizations such as the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, which is a wonderful community of people from training institutes all over the United States and Canada. I don't know what the average age there, but it might well be sort of over, it's over 60. When I'm in those meetings, I feel like one of the youngsters. And that's not a good sign. I think they've been rather the Jungian world has been rather unimaginative in reaching out to young people and making training affordable and easily possible. I think this idea that, well, if you're motivated, you'll find a way is not helpful. So I'm concerned a bit about the future in the field. I do think it's important to dialogue with the field. I was very, very taken for many years by the movements that you see in the Society of Analytical Psychology, mostly through the writings of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, which has had a profound influence on my sense of myself and my clinical practice. I love that work, but I also sometimes think that some of those Jungians, so-called Jungians, have really lost what was also important in Jung, and have kind of sort of dissolved Jung into a form of object relations theory, where psyche is sort of just no more than a matter of mind and internal objects passing, or at least relations between internal objects passing back and forth. Theoretically, they might have an archetypal foundation, but that doesn't mean very much. So I think that the field does need to integrate itself with contemporary thought, but I think that we should also work on what we have to contribute to a lot of contemporary thought. I don't think it should be a one-way dialogue. It's something like a sensibility that has a sense that we are in psychological life that surrounds us. I love that passing comment in Jung's commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower, where he says something to the effect that, in his typically sarcastic way, he says something like, perhaps there are some fish that think the sea is inside them, but rather, the psyche surrounds us like the sea surrounds us. So we are in psyche. And although that can be taken in a sort of solipsistic way, I think that's just profoundly misses the broad thrust of Jung's project. I think it's really interesting that Jung had a sense of himself as a historical figure and the historical embeddedness of his ideas. More than any of the early psychoanalysts, he had a sense of that sort of sense of history. So he was very aware of how Freud came into being through the repressions of late 19th century Victorian Europe. And he understood his own work historically as a counterpoint to the Age of Enlightenment, going back to the Renaissance and particularly then since the 17th century, with its rationalism and materialism, and his fondness for alchemy and for archaic terms like shadow and anima and unus mundus and the Great Mother. This reaching into a language is reaching into a pre-Renaissance language, a pre-Enlightenment language, because I think he wants to try to recover for psychology something of the aesthetic sensibility that we have lost in the age of enlightenment. And this is where I think Jung is really sophisticated, is that he wants to do so without, we can't all just regress and pretend we don't know what we know, scientifically say. So we don't just live in an anthropomorphic world anymore, or a world full of gods and demons like Hieronymus Bosch's pictures or something. That's not how we live. So he wants to recover something of that sensibility, but do so in a metaphorical and psychologically sophisticated way. When he talks about the primacy of the psyche, I like to read that as his way of being really humble and wanting to say that he doesn't want to reach beyond his epistemological frame and limits as a psychologist. And I think that he wants to retain that sort of sense, even as he recovers something of that pre-Renaissance sensibility in the sort of the aesthetics and depth of psychological life. If I have a contribution to make to the field conceptually, I think it might be that I've really helped distinguish psyche and mind in Jung's work. I wonder sometimes to what extent it's a matter of translation, but it does seem that Jung himself uses the two interchangeably often. In my dissertation, which became the book Jung and Phenomenology, I have a whole chapter on psyche. I spent more than a month, every day from morning to night, starting the chapter and throwing it away. It just didn't work. What I was going to do was to say that we have to get rid of this notion of some sort of interior psyche or mind and move ontologically much more to a sense of our being in the world as an open clearing within which everything plus ourselves is gathered. I mean, that's a Heidegger / Medard Boss kind of view of the world. And I should mention maybe that I was in all those years in supervision with the director of my dissertation, who was an analysand of Medard Boss. So I was steeped in that tradition. But it just didn't work, because psyche I couldn't squeeze psyche into that critique. So I then did the sort of thing that a doctoral student would do, which is that I made notes on every single entrance in the index under psyche in Jung's collected works and all the supplementary volumes that I could. And that alone took me weeks and weeks. And then I started thematizing these. And the upshot is that I came to realize that psyche is not mind, despite his linguistic confusion. That mind is much more our capacity for thought and reason, thinking, as a sort of a function of psychological life. But when it comes to the psyche, Jung is trying to say that we are embedded in the psyche, and the psyche is not mind. The psyche surrounds us as the world in which we are embedded and with which we are engaged psychologically. The psyche is the psychological world that we inhabit, not as a world of mental representations, but that we existentially actually inhabit. You and I sitting here making a movie, noises intruding from the outside. This is all the stuff of our psychological lives. So when Jung describes the self as the totality of the psyche, and it's essentially a kind of synonym, there's something very interesting about that. But what I think he's doing is to say that the psyche is also, on one hand, it's the psyche. It has its anonymity, its collectivity, its cultural history and language and the images and narratives that make up our lives. The mountain outside and the blue sky is all the gathering of psychological life. But when we call it the self, what it does say is that there is a way in which that's also mine. So that my profile on the psyche, my being in the psyche, is a little different from your being in the psyche. The psyche is mine in the same sort of way that my accent is mine. I can't get out of it. It's just here. And yet it also doesn't belong to me. It's mine, but I'm not the author of my own accent. So I'm not the author of my own psyche any more than I'm the author of my own accent. That comes out of a place and a cultural history. My grandfather and my father are speaking in my accent, and of course they are themselves embedded in worlds of African colonialism and British history before that. So the psyche is all that, but I think we can call it the self when we want to say, well, that's true, but I'm not anonymous in it. I do have my own accent and my own, I use English in my own way. These are my words, even as they're not my words. So I can carry it and own it. At least it's the psyche in which I am gathered. And then what do we mean by ego? Well, the ego is how I actually really appropriate it as mine. And the self is a sort of an intermediate kind of place in that. So that's basically how I see it and how I write about it in Jungian phenomenology. And by the way, I did an interesting thing. When in that dissertation, I started to spell out the parallels. Once I'd realized what psyche was as a place of world opening and gathering, I then made a list, and there was something like a dozen ways in which what my interpretation of the psyche in Jung and Heidegger's notion of Dasein are thematically equivalent. So what I think is that Jung was intuiting what was much more formally articulated as Dasein in Heidegger's work. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, maybe it's a duck. So that's how I move to my understanding of psyche.